Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm Kim Kelderhouse, and I'm the director of the Leelanau Historical Society. We're one of the hosts today, along with the Omena Historical Society. And then we're very thankful to be here in the Suttons Bay School Auditorium. Thank you to the school for letting us use this space. I am very happy to have Emily here to present on this wonderful project that she's spent, I think, 2 years on now. Yeah. So it's been really fun to be involved with this and hear updates about this project, and really nice now to be at the point that she's at and to hear this really long summary of things. So without further ado, I will pass things off to Emily. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Kim, for that introduction, and thanks to the Leelanau and Omena Historical Societies for having me here tonight. Is that too loud? Are we good? Okay. It's loud up here. When I was in graduate school, I attended a lecture one evening, and the guest lecturer began by announcing that he had 73 points to make in his lecture, and I've always sort of wanted to do that. It felt like a trap, but anyway, I'm not going to make 73 points tonight. I am, though, going to start by giving sort of a roadmap for my plan for this presentation. I'm going to start with my own background, but briefly, and only because I think it gives some important context for how I came to and at this project. And then I'm going to do what I promised I would do, which is give a project summary. And as far as that next part of the title goes, I will talk a bit about why talking about the past is important for the present and the future. And then I am going to talk about a couple of bits that have come out of this project in terms of research and things that I've learned that I think are especially interesting. Before I do any of that, though, I want to be very clear about my role. I'm not Anishinaabe. I don't speak for or represent an Anishinaabe perspective, and it's certainly not my place to tell Anishinaabe history according to the tradition and wisdom of the Anishinaabe community. And I can't see very well, but if there are members of the Grand Traverse Band or the Kchi Wiikwedong Anishinaabe community here, miigwech for coming, and I sincerely hope you'll tell me what you think of this afterwards. So my background, I am from Suttons Bay, and now I live in Traverse City. And starting when I was in college, and through graduate school and beyond, I worked as a field archaeologist for 15 years. Somewhere between 2 and 12 months out of the year, I was working in the field in Italy. And most of my field work and research focused on small indigenous communities in southern Italy and the impact of colonization on those people. When I moved back to Traverse City, it took a few years, but after that much time running on the Tart Trail past this, I finally stopped and read its little plaque. And the little plaque says, "Old Indian Trail, Cadillac to Traverse City." And for me, it was one of those sort of lightning bolt, thunderclap moments, and a moment of real reckoning. I was somewhat embarrassed and sad and excited all at the same time. And I did some searching of my archaeological soul and realized how little I knew, despite having grown up here, about the history of the people and the land before European settlement, so before about 1840, and how little I could see of that history. In Traverse City, I could see Mr. Boardman and Mr. Hannah very clearly, and could see how they'd lived on the land and what they had left there, their legacy. But this little concrete monument along the Tart Trail at West End Beach was the first reference I'd seen to an earlier and much longer history. And to me, it looked a bit like a complacent legacy of erasure and assimilation policies. So my conclusion was, number one, if I didn't know much and if there was a way to know more, and this let me know that there was a way to know more because someone knew about this trail, then I should find it. And number two, if there's a way for all of us to tell a bigger, broader, more complex and therefore more accurate story about ourselves and the place that we live, we should do that. In the 2020s, there's no reason, in my opinion, to accept old and exclusive ways of teaching and memorializing history, particularly when that history has such a vibrant and vital present, when this continues to be the homeland of the Grand Traverse Band and the Kchi Wiikwedong Anishinaabe. So this was about 3 years ago, and I started like I knew how to start, looking for books and articles and research and records and anything else that might fill in my own big blanks. I started by trying to get to the bottom of this old Indian trail. And thanks to the man who put the markers in the ground, Frank Edewagishik, that wasn't too hard. He told me about his role as a representative to the State Sesquicentennial Committee in 1987 and his project to finish marking the old Indian trail. So a segment had been marked earlier and Frank's sesquicentennial project was to finish that. And there are some great pictures that the Traverse Area District Library has of these people who may or may not have asked permission to put these markers in the ground. So Frank is the one in the blue shirt holding the shovel. And here's marker 33, the same one that first picture was of. Frank was tremendously and generously helpful in listening to my ideas and figuring out what to do next. Frank and also Bill Rastetter pointed me to W.B. Hinsdale's Archaeological Atlas of Michigan, which is something I suggest you all read. It was published in 1931, and W.B. Hinsdale was an archaeologist working at the University of Michigan, and I suspect that in 1931 he looked around and saw the Anishinaabe history disappearing from the landscape and fading from memory from people who would be able to speak to that earlier history. And so he gathered together all of the bits of historical and archaeological information that he could and made these maps of every region of our state. We don't need to get into too much detail, but the red lines are trails and the hashed marks are gardens. There are villages and campsites and burials marked here too. And you'll see that some of the dots are very large, which makes them hard to pinpoint exactly on a map, and that was intentional. He didn't want people to be able to go do damage to things. Most importantly, thanks to Bill Rastetter, I also met members of the Grand Traverse Band Tribal Council and community who were willing to listen to me describe a realization about history and storytelling that they had already known and felt for generations. I knew right away that the books and articles and research and records were an important part of the story, but I also saw and heard very quickly that they were a narrow, biased record, and that the more important perspective was that of the families of the people in those 19th century records who live here now, the Kchi Wiikwedong Anishinaabe, here. Relatives of the Anishinaabe who have lived around the Big Bay since the glaciers receded. So I want to note that reading about the Anishinaabe past in this area is not especially easy. It takes a lot of digging and time. You have to follow what feels a bit like a trail of breadcrumbs sometimes. And I think there's real opportunity to make history more accessible, both on the land and on the page. I do not mean the National Park Service any ill will when I put this slide up, but as recently as yesterday, if you go to the Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore website and follow the park home, learn about the park, history and culture, people, Native Americans, this is what you get, with a question asking if it's helpful. No, it's not helpful. But no malice towards the park, but I did think that this was pretty representative. So I started to propose new signs inspired directly by Frank Edouard-Gashik's monuments to anyone who would listen, and suggested that they should be installed on public land along Anishinaabe trails in Traverse City and in Leelanau County. Frank kindly suggested that maybe the project should be to expand on what he did, use those same polygonal white concrete markers, and just keep going, using, get back to Hinsdale, using Hinsdale's guidelines, just, expand the marked trails. But to me that looked hard, particularly because of private property issues. And M22 also is hard. So I sort of expanded the idea of trails and figured that a trail could be on land or water, both ways that people moved themselves from place to place. And also figured that markers could, they didn't have to sort of be in a string along one trail, but one could kind of represent a bigger trail or a bigger way of movement. And I also figured that they should be in high visibility places so that people would see them. I asked a Little Traverse Bay Band GIS specialist named Alan Proctor to help make a new map. And he used the Hinsdale information and other piecemeal records to make this, which is not much to look at on this screen, but it's a neat map. And it is publicly available if you have GIS capabilities, and it will live on the project website and in other places. The goal is to make it useful. So I defined my own role early on as convener or coordinator because I thought that to the very greatest possible extent, the form and meaning of new signs should reflect Anishinaabe perspectives and priorities. I knew in general terms what I thought should be achieved by the signs, and I also knew that I was not the one to decide much of anything. I'm still floored that these patient, generous people agreed to work with me on this. Chris Cornelius is an Oneida tribe architect and designer from Wisconsin, and he designed the signs themselves, the objects. And Joanne Cook, Eva Petoskey, and Arlene Kushada, who are Grand Traverse Band elders, wrote the text that will go on the plaques on the signs. The Grand Traverse Band Tribal Council approved the project and contributed text translation so that the signs can be fully bilingual, English and Anishinaabe-Moan. So my primary jobs have been to fund the project, to work with municipalities to get permission to install signs on public land, and most importantly, to listen. Through listening, the project expanded to include a documentary film component. Shane McSabe, who's a Grand Traverse Band member, is working on a film element about the Kchi Wiikwedong Anishinaabe, past and present, and thinking towards the future. The project also expanded to include light pole banners. I didn't include a picture of them, which is an oversight. But they're hanging up in Traverse City on Front Street right now. And they're basically a vocabulary lesson. There's a word in Anishinaabe-Moan and then the translation in English underneath. And there's no explanation. So might have been a little confusing, but they're beautiful. Mark Wilson helped design them. I included some, oops, that's not right. There. I included some kind of rough and ready maps, but the signs, when installed, will be in Traverse City. There are 4 of them. One of them is off this map at the Brown Bridge Quiet Area, and the other 3 are the yellow dots up towards the top left corner of the map. And they will be in Leelanau County on the red dots. Apologies for the giant Peterson Park mark, but one will be there. One in Suttons Bay, one in Omena, one in Northport, one at Peterson Park, and one in Leeland. So my goal has been to leave the door wide open from the beginning for input, and also to honor requests to make changes to the plan midstream as needed, and always to defer to the experts. So over the last 18 months, the 5 municipalities that are in charge of these places reviewed and approved the proposal to give new signs to them to be installed at agreed upon sites on public land. And I'm grateful to the commissions and the boards of the city of Traverse City, the villages of Suttons Bay and Northport, and Leelanau and Leeland townships for working through that process with me. Many organizations and individuals, including the Traverse City Parks and Rec Department, TART, the Grand Traverse and Leelanau Conservancies, and the Conservation District have been supporters of this project from the get-go, and I'm really grateful for their camaraderie and stewardship. The project has been very fortunate to have been awarded about $150,000 in grant funding over the last 2.5 years. All of the funds have gone to and continue to go to the people who collaborate, who work on this project, and the output, the products. The Traverse Area Historical Society Board kindly agreed to let me organize the project under their nonprofit umbrella. And the funders, to whom I'm very grateful, are here. I don't know if anybody from any of these organizations is here tonight. If you are, thank you. Through the Native American Heritage Fund grant, one of the grants listed here, during the school year, 2 years ago, the project partnered with the Northport Public School to involve students in some research questions and a series of presentations by project collaborators. In addition to the funders, I also, and then I'll stop thanking, I also want to thank the Old Mission Peninsula Historical Society for its interest in the project, and of course the Leelanau and Omena Historical Societies, who have been very generous with time and resources. So, signs. One of them is up. It went in last month at the Brown Bridge Quiet Area. This was a last moment decision on the part of New Art Signs. They're the shop in Traverse City that has fabricated the signs. It doesn't have a plaque yet, as you can see. The plaque will be added in the spring at the same time that the remaining 8 signs with plaques are ready for installation. So the signs are different shapes and sizes, but they all are made of steel and carry this same pattern that comes from Anishinaabe beadwork traditions. And so they're easily identifiable as parts of a whole. A point that has been made to me over and over, oh, here's another view of the same sign at Brown Bridge. So the point that's been made over and over throughout this project is that history and the past are important, yes, but only in the context of the present and the future. We're still here, is the critical message. It's a fundamentally important reminder not to put history in a box on the shelf. The indigenous practice of making decisions in the interest of future generations is also critical. The idea of a past that informs the present and the future is actually the basis for the sign design. The designer made these signs, these objects, to look like rocks. The idea being that the Anishinaabe history and people are as enduring as rocks. The plaques will have the 7 grandfather teachings rewritten in the words of the Grand Traverse Band elders who worked on the project. 7 of the plaques will have the 7 teachings. 2 of the plaques will have a summary of history. So from my own perspective, it's important for communities, our community in this case, to tell a big story, to stare the hard parts right in the eyes, and to account for them in understanding how we got here. I thought I might have to try to explain why signs and monuments and diverse representation and stories are important, but the New York Times and the Mellon Foundation did it for me yesterday with the announcement that the foundation is committing a total of $500 million to funding new monuments throughout the US to do what I just described, to tell bigger stories. Looking around our region, starting with Frank's marker, I saw that his markers, there are 33 of them total between West Bay Beach in Traverse City and Lake Mitchell in Cadillac. So including Frank's 33 markers, there's a sort of watermark on our land, traces of Anishinaabe history. So one way to see it is to drive around and ask your husband to take pictures out the car window. You don't have to do that though. You can also find this watermark on maps, and the most current of maps that our local and state and federal governments put out. So it's very hard to read. Let's see how this works. New? There. All right. If you could read this, you could see that it says Nagunaba Shores, which must have been the name of a development on what we would call Stony Point these days. And then over here, way up in the top, on the top, it says Indian Village. And these are parcel maps that are on the Leelanau County website. So if you're trying to figure out who owns what piece of property today, you'll still find these labels on that map, which to me speak to a memory of something that was there a long time ago. There were traces of Anishinaabe history that are already gone. So these are pictures from the Traverse Area the Traverse Area District Library's photo collection. The bridge, I believe, is over Mitchell Creek. It's certainly not called that anymore. And these cabins are no longer there. They were the Indian Trail Lodge. So let's see if I can put this back in now. Okay. So what does all that say? To me, it says that there's a very long memory of the people and land before 1840 here. It also says that history is hard to shake, fortunately. And it says that we can and should pull that into the light more than it is right now, beyond street signs, beyond obscure labels on government maps. And we can and should start to tell the bigger, more explicit story and find ways to market and to connect it to the present. So then what about all the reading of the books and the reports and the research and the records that I did? When I put my head into the books and the archives, I wondered, is there value in this? If talking and listening and making room for perspectives and expression and monuments is the meaningful stuff, then are these 19th century diaries and letters and lists worth much of anything at this point? And I think they are. Before we do, oh no, we're good. So I spent, oh, you know what, actually? I have a missing slide here. There it is. Whoa. There, okay. So I made just a little summary of resources that I have accessed, anyway, trying to get as close as I could to the Anishinaabe people who lived here. And we don't have written records by them, but we have records about them, which is a complicated perspective, of course, but it's what we have. And I do believe that there is value in sticking with it. So there are maps and land records, plain old maps, and then surveys and patents and deeds. And then there are the treaties and the treaty language, the Treaty of Washington from 1836, in which the Odawa and Ojibwe tribes in the north part of our state and north part of the Lower Peninsula and east part of the Upper Peninsula ceded land to the federal government. And then the Treaty of Detroit from 1855, which further established the relationship between the Anishinaabe and the government and the land. There are census lists, Durant rolls, annuity lists, agency reports, and school reports. Some of the most, I would say, detailed and personal information comes from the letters and the diaries and the reports of the missionaries. Peter Doherty, who was the Presbyterian minister first on Old Mission and then subsequently at Omena. George Smith, who was the congregational minister first in the Peterson Park area and then at Wakazooville, south of Northport. And the Catholic missionary priests, there are quite a few of them. So I'll get back to that excerpt where we landed previously. Here we go. So I've spent quite a bit of time with the missionary records, in particular comparing the Protestant records and the Catholic records. It's pretty entertaining. They do quite a bit of griping about one another. In some ways, they're very different types of documents, and they have agendas that at times are the same and at times are really different. On the Protestant side, Peter Doherty lived with a band and speaks very personally about individuals, gives names, talks about the details of daily life. On the Catholic side, the priest, the contemporary priest, contemporary with Peter Doherty and George Smith, he didn't live here. He lived up near Harbor Springs, so his observations and records are really different. That particular priest is named Francis Xavier Pierce, and he was a Slovenian missionary. So from Doherty and Pierce in particular, so Presbyterian and Catholic, we can piece together the world that they lived in, their roles as parts of huge conversion machines that are, like I said, countered by some personal daily details of life as a white American and European minority reliant on translators. With varying degrees of empathy, letters between 1836 and 1855, so those treaty dates, both men report high anxiety among the Anishinaabe here about their future and about the possibility of being forcibly removed from Michigan. So this slide shows an excerpt of a letter from Peter Doherty where he remarks about how disturbed the people who he lived with felt about some of the things that they'd heard about the possibility of removal. On the Catholic side, Father Pierce says essentially the same thing. He talks about how uncertain they feel about their legal status and what will happen to them and to the land that they live on. So they discuss the movement and settlement of Anishinaabe bands as a certain form of settlement was effectively forced on the Anishinaabe, who chose to remain in northern Michigan after the Treaty of 1836. So in these same letters, we see what European Americans didn't and couldn't know. And this is maybe where it gets even more interesting. I had coffee with 2 Anishinaabe women earlier this year and mentioned that I'd been reading the Catholic records. And they basically said, I'm sorry to hear that. And then they said, well, yeah, but those are a really great illustration of how clever and resilient our families were. And I said, please tell me more about that. And they said, well, have you read about our clans or our ceremonies in the Catholic records? No. Have you read about our grandmothers or our aunties or the children? I said, no. And then they said, well, that's not because they were being ignored. It's because they were being hidden and protected. And I, after that, looked at these letters in a completely different way and saw so much more agency, so much more control that was still being figured out and exerted by the Anishinaabe, despite colonization happening to and around them. I added this because I mentioned that the missionaries gripe about one another. This is a note from Peter Doherty, who says that among other things which we've had to annoy us, the Catholic priest from the Little Travers came here the week after I returned. So there's a lot of that. You can find it on both sides, griping about one another. Larry Wyckoff is a person who I have not had the pleasure of meeting in person, but is a person with whom I have had the pleasure of corresponding via email. And he is a researcher who's done a tremendous amount of very detailed work to connect government land records with Anishinaabe individuals and groups. He made the map that we're looking at here by looking at allotment records around 1860 and matching them up to the land that is explicitly defined as having been claimed or purchased by individuals or families. And then he divided that by band, and his report talks about the movement of those groups of people up until the point of settlement, of allotment or purchase. And so at least around 1860, and he says that this is not complete, but this is how settlement began to look on the Leelanau Peninsula. Excuse me. Pardon me. So using Larry's research and using the missionary records, we can sort of start to layer these things one on top of another to understand, in terms of outside observation, what happened in this period of upheaval. Excuse me. And that's kind of a general point and a quick dash through some of the records that are out there. And hopefully an indication that it's most interesting when you start to sort of poke at it and push at it, and when you absolutely don't take it at face value. A very specific point that has come out of my own reading of missionary records is a name for the village that was near what is now Peterson Park. So like Augusta Town, which is north of Omena, and Wakazooville, which is south of Northport, I'm going to call it Louisville. It looks like Louisville, I know, but I am not sure that we should assume a French accent here in northern Michigan. So Louisville is noted in quite a few written records. It doesn't show up on many maps. In fact, I don't think I've seen any maps with Louisville on it. But like Augusta Town and Wakazooville, the name Louisville is very not Anishinaabe. And one place where it has been repeated right down the line is in the record of the Ringnose Cabin. So if any of you are from Northport, the Ringnose Cabin might be familiar. For those of us who are not from Northport, the Ringnose Cabin is kind of a surprise. I'll speak for myself. I was surprised by the Ringnose Cabin. So the quick story of the Ringnose Cabin is actually summarized quite well here by Martin Melkild, who was a local historian who is deceased. Here he talks about Peter Ringnose, who, according to his family history, was the owner of a log home that originally, as Martin tells us, was near Peterson Park. And then was taken apart sometime in the late 1800s and taken to his family farm to be used, to be lived in. And then later, fast forward to the 1960s, the farm passed into the Fredrickson family. They still own the farm. And Martin noticed that this cabin that he'd known about for his whole life wasn't being used. So he asked if he could turn it into a Boy Scout project and take it apart, log by log, take it to Traverse City and put it back together, log by log, and use it for Boy Scout purposes. And so it's still there where they put it back together at Camp Graylick. So here's a picture of it when it was on the Melkild/Fredrickson family farm. And this picture is one that I took last spring, so it's doing well. So as recently as, I think this inventory is from the 1990s. This is an excerpt from an inventory of buildings at Camp Graylick, which became relevant in the last couple of years as Rotary Camps and Services tried to figure out what to do with Camp Graylick. Anyway, this is from their inventory, and it kind of repeats Martin Melkild's story about the fact that this cabin came from Louisville. So, we'll set Louisville aside for a second. Cathead Village is a place that does show up on maps as early as the 1850s. In the place where, according to those descriptions of Louisville should be. So I began to suspect, and with Kim Kelderhaus's help, and also Mark Smith's help, I began to just sort of assume that Louisville and Cathead Village were the same thing. In the Catholic records, another name popped up, and it's the name that starts with K up there in the top script. This guy, Pierce, we're back to the same Slovenian priest, he spells it at least 5 different ways. Clearly, he was hearing it and trying to figure out how to spell it and did it however it felt right in the moment. But even within this one record, it's spelled in 2 different ways. And it's always referred to along with Grand Travers. So he talks about coming to Grand Travers and the schools that he had established at Grand Travers, and then also at this place. And it dawned on me that they must be kind of close together because of the way he was describing them. And so once again, I thought, well, are we talking about Louisville again? Or Cathead Village? And finally, just the other day, I found a letter from Father Pierce, our Slovenian priest, that made it abundantly clear that yes, Cathead Village, I underlined it in pink, it's probably hard to see, but Cathead Village is in fact the same thing as Kachagen's Ondebaning, which is this name that kept popping up. So I was excited because I felt like we had finally gotten back to the Anishinaabe history of this village. It had been sort of described in these various ways and terms and names that really weren't theirs, but I felt like we'd finally gotten back to a name that meant something about that place to the people who were the first ones to live there. And so I asked for some help understanding the name. And the feedback that I got was that it refers to things that need to be stored for later, like in a root cellar, which is, ties the name to the function, to the land, in a way that is in keeping with the Anishinaabe tradition of names, rather than naming things after men who live there. So why is that important? Well, I just think it's fun, but it's also important because we see how European it was for villages to be named after men, just as it was not Anishinaabe, to be allotted portions of land and effectively prohibited from moving seasonally. And we see the details of change and wholesale disruption of a worldview, a language, and a way of living and relating to land, which only works, as I said before, if we don't take these records at face value, but rather read them for human impact, which is the part that is often not spelled out. So to linger a moment on this place, now that we know what it's called, I included this slide. I mentioned George Smith, the congregational minister, previously. He, in his writings, talks about the moment at which the band that he lived with, the Ojibwe band who at that time were in the Grand Rapids area, the time when they decided to move north during this period of disruption and with kind of settlement on the horizon. And he refers to the fact that he and this group of people purchased about 2 miles on the shore and several lots lying back, and comments that the most people from the band had stayed in this new land of theirs to start preparing the land to live there, which is then this same place. So again, pulling at different resources to start to people a place and understand how they got there and what happened when they did. So here I just kind of threw a bunch of images together to illustrate that. So we're back to Larry Wyckoff's map and those plat maps from the county website and the land survey map from 1855 or 6, and a map that Kim Kelderhouse generously shared with me showing Cathead Village over there. And we can sort of see how all these layers feed the story and how they fit together over time, and once again, how memories of these places and these people linger, right, in the maps and the tools we use today. Oh, and then I did put that tiny picture of the ring-nose cabin there because it came from that place. And I've been working on trying to identify the exact location, original location of that house. And it requires some fairly large leaps of faith, but think we're getting somewhere with that. So, as much as we see, or I see, effects of assimilation and erasure policies and practices through these records, I've sort of done a freewheeling job of showing these records. Thanks to these same records, we see that erasure, it didn't work. Thank goodness. And we can see what the Kchi Wiikwedong Anishinaabe, who live here now, resisted and what they endured. And we now, in 2023, know to look to them to understand the history that was lived and the history that is taught. So to summarize the summary, the project isn't exactly finished, and I'm not sure that it ever really will be for me personally. I take Momodé's words as a sort of personal challenge. I go back to this thought regularly. I won't read it out loud, but it's here if you'd like to read it. The signs and the banners and the film, I think, really will do what this project set out to do, which is to give greater representation, greater visibility to a history and a people who have been here the longest and who are here and who will be here. But that's just a small step. I think that there's a lot of room to see and hear more from and about Anishinaabe, past and present, and for the future. Ultimately, really, the best summary is that the idea for this project was in a good place at a good time. It has asked for expertise in design, public art, public history, municipal processes, and tribal and non-tribal government protocol and policies. It has also asked for time, favors, generosity, conversation, wisdom, vulnerability, creativity, encouragement, discouragement, and criticism. And at every turn, at every touch point, people have agreed that the intended outcome was worth it and worth their effort. And for that, I am really forever humbled and grateful and lucky. And ultimately proud that this project has been done in what I think is a good way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. And if you probably noticed, we had a camera at the back. So this was recorded and it will be available later. And so if there's people you know you want to share this with, please get on our email list or give the Leelanau Historical Society a call and we'll make sure you get the link to access that. But we're going to open things up for questions. And if you want to raise your hands, and I'm going to bring you the mic so that the rest of the crowd can hear and Emily can hear clearly. So I will start right here.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Can you tell us more about the signs themselves? Which signs will have the grandfather teachings on them? Which ones will have history on them? And what history will they tell us?
Sure. The signs with the history text will be at Clinch Park and at Peterson Park. And the grandfather teachings will be at the other 7 locations. And we have decided which teachings go at which location, but I don't have that list in front of me. The history is beautifully written by the same people who articulated the grandfather teachings. And I don't have the text in front of me, so I won't read it out loud. But it's brief, but rather poignant, I would say.
Living in Michigan, we're surrounded by Anishinaabe names. Some perhaps inappropriately applied, like the name of our county. Others, real place names. It'd be really nice to have some kind of record of that history, of how those names came to be and what they meant when and what they mean now.
Yeah, I agree. You could do a project. I do not know of a place where that already exists. No. Mm-mm.
I'd just like to say thank you for this project. I've been following it, as you know, for the past 3 years. You said you started out doing archaeology in southern Italy. I'm just wondering what you feel the value would be, or the applicability to this scenario, of having an archaeological review board or committee that can identify some areas like the vicinity of Peterson Park where there may still be tangible history in the ground as a former habitation site, former burials, former cultivation areas. And if there is to be future development in that vicinity, that we take the time to pay attention to anything that might be disturbed there.
That's a thorny question. Thank you. So in the United States, archaeology is treated so differently than it is in other parts of the world. And no private property owner is held responsible for paying any attention whatsoever to what is on or under the ground. Once the property's theirs, it's theirs. So what exists currently in terms of archaeological knowledge in this area is fairly coincidental outside of the Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore. They do have to employ archaeologists anytime earth is moved with federal dollars. So the park actually has a lot of archaeological information that is not, has not been systematically made available to the public. So it's hard to access. But there is sort of sporadic, like I said, coincidental archaeological information that has been accumulated over the years throughout the area. It would be great if more people paid more attention to what is or could be in the ground. I hope that happens at some point. You know, there's really advanced technology now to find things without disturbing the dirt. And it would, in fact, be really great if landowners in these areas where we can see, especially older maps, that there was something, that there were people. It would be great if those landowners could or would pay more attention to that. It's my opinion.
As a child in the 50s, I do remember a small graveyard right next to Peterson Park on a little high-rise, which would currently be near where Monique Drive meets Foxview Drive. And we would go over and look at it, but there's now a landfill that fills a lot of that intersection. But as I recall, it's on a hill behind a house which is still undisturbed. So, I mean, I don't know if that's ever been pointed out or remarked by anybody. I remember going over there multiple times in the 50s, but I haven't looked for it recently. There must be some knowledge locally there among the people who live there about it.
I think you're right. I saw that on a plat map, and there was a little carve out, looked like an easement of some sort in an otherwise rectangular lot, and it noted that there was a cemetery there. And I have not tried to find it. But I did notice on these photos that there's been a lot of excavation of that area, and I just hope that the landowners knew to work around that.
Thank you, Emily, for the presentation. My question is, could you help this non-historian type explain your process for finding all these documents? Like, where do you even begin, and maybe, and where are they? Like, I noticed one was at the University of Notre Dame. So how do you track all that?
Yeah, that's what I meant by breadcrumbs. I started by reading a book and then finding the reference and then tracking the reference down, and you sort of go reference by reference by reference till you get to these original documents. The Omena Historical Society was hugely helpful with the Doherty papers, they're online at the Presbyterian Society, and Mark Smith in particular is an absolute expert. I don't know if Mark's here, but he's a total pro with the Doherty history. The Catholic records, I honestly don't remember how I got there, but I found, actually I do remember, I could figure out that it was the Cincinnati diocese that was in charge of this area at that time. The Detroit diocese had not yet been formed. And so I called the Cincinnati diocese to ask about the paperwork, and they said, oh yeah, a lot of that went to Notre Dame. And that was good information because the archivists at Notre Dame are very helpful people and have sent me the original documents, which is usually great. Some of it's in very old German, which is a challenge, but that's how I got there. I think, I've said this before, someone should pull all of this together and write a book, or at least just pull it together so that it is easier to find for more of us. So then it could sit on a shelf or sit on a lot of shelves in our area for people to look at. That'd be handy. So if somebody wants to write a book, I'm happy to give you some websites. Hi, Jess.
Question. I saw you said that Cathead Bay, and you were referencing an ancient native name for it.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that the Cathead name is actually derived from that? Because they sound sort of similar when you say them out loud. And I'm wondering, do you know where Cathead Bay got its name?
I don't. The French, so this clever Slovenian priest writes in German and French and Latin. He can do it all. And the document that I put up here, which was one of his letters in French, refers to it as Tête de Chat, which made me wonder if it became cathead via French, or if it was first English cathead and then he was just speaking French. I don't know is the short answer.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, thank you, Emily. Such a gratitude to everyone who worked with you, and thank you for summarizing it for us. I wondered if you could tell us a little more about the video history and who speaks and is interviewed in that.
In the video?
Part of your project, yeah.
Yeah. I really handed that over to the filmmaker, to Shane. So there are parts that I don't know about it yet, but I do know that he managed to get, I think, over 1,000 hours of interview time with Grand Traverse Band elders, and he's coming back to do more. And his intention is to sort of shape it into either one film or a series of small sort of teachings-based films, and then to give all of that footage to GTV so that it continues to exist here in its raw form. So I'll let you know when that happens.
Since this all started out with Indian trails, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what did Indian trails look like? How are they maintained? Were they really any different than pre-industrial roads anywhere in the world?
It's very hard for me to hear up here. What are the Indian what?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was wondering if you could tell us what Indian trails look like.
Trails. Well, no, because we can't, okay. I was gonna say we can't see them anymore. I have been told that there may be sections in Leelanau County of the trails noted on the Hinsdale maps that might still be able to be seen in the woods. I have not been out to look at that yet, but I would imagine that they did look in the past and probably still look, if we can see them, a bit like a dirt path.
I was just wondering would they, if you take a larger archaeological perspective, would they look any different from any pre-industrial road or trail anywhere?
I doubt it. Although I do remember Frank Edowagishik talking about how in sections of the trail, sort of deep in the woods of Buckley, there was evidence of very, very old like camp use alongside the trail, and also places where river crossings were clear, that tree falls had very clearly been manipulated, been managed to make them into a usable section of trail. So I think there are some distinct characteristics. I have not seen them myself. And
there were bridges and there was an effort to maintain the trails?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have family stories of people in our family taking trails going to different places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lovely story about Perry Hanna in Traverse City traveling south on a so-called Indian trail with the help of a guide who knew how to navigate that trail. So they were what was here. They were what was used, and they were very effective. So I think they were used, up until the point that there were trains and then paved roads.
Well, those roads, in many instances, actually follow the trail.
Yeah, exactly. They were simply paved over, right? Like M22, for example. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just one point about Cathead. I think it probably could have easily referred to the point, because we also always talk about headlands or points, like when you say Cape or Cabo, you're really talking about the headland. And it's within sight of what we call Cathead Point. So perhaps, this is just conjecture, but perhaps it was a point that appeared to look like a crouching cat or something of that sort, you never know. But when you see the word head, often in geography it's referring to a point of land. It's a waypoint for sailors.
Yeah.
Hi, great job.
Hi, Brad. Thank you.
Just to answer the gentleman's question, another part of it. There's one on Washington Street, I think, is where it is, where they purposely molded the tree to be bent in a certain way. That's another, I've actually come across those tramping in the woods in this area before. So if you're ever out walking around and see a tree that has a right angle on it, that was done on purpose to help mark trails. And the other important part to remember is that their highways were water. So they followed coast, every river, every stream. That's how they delineated territory. That was how they got around the most. Overland travel is, of course, much harder. It's harder to carry stuff, so on and so forth. So, but if you do go tramping around, it's remarkable what you can see if you're looking for it. And what she said about river breaks and clearings that don't look quite natural, those things are all over this area. And so that's a big part of what makes this project so important. So just all the way out.
Thanks.
Looks like we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you to the Omena Historical Society. And once again, thank you to Suttons Bay School and to the Boardman Review who's recording this. If you are interested in more information about the two historical societies, we've got brochures on the tables outside the door, and our staff members have name tags if you have any in-person questions for us. Thank you.